Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to come somewhere with me. Somewhere it is not easy to go. It is the middle of the night, and there is no moon. The air is cold and wet against your skin, the kind of damp that gets into your bones and stays there. The ground beneath your bare feet is soft with rotting leaves and black mud. And somewhere behind you, far off through the trees, but not far enough, you can hear the sound of dogs. You are standing at the edge of a forest you have never seen before, in a country that does not believe you are a person. In the eyes of the law of this land, you are not a man, not a woman, not a child. You are property, a thing that can be bought and sold, counted in a ledger beside the horses and the barrels of flour, beaten, mortgaged, and buried in an unmarked grave without anyone ever writing down your name. And standing in front of you, in the dark, is a woman. She is small. She is not even 5 feet tall. Her clothes are soaked through from wading the rivers, and her feet are wrapped in rags. There is a deep scar across her forehead that catches what little starlight there is. She does not look like a soldier. She does not look like a general. She looks like someone's tired mother. And she is holding out her hand to you. She does not ask if you are afraid. She already knows that you are. She knows because she is afraid too. She has been afraid every single night she has done this. But she looks at you with steady, patient eyes, and she asks you the only question that matters now. Are you coming? Because this woman has walked this road before. Not once, not twice. 19 times she walked south, back into the very heart of slavery, into the one place on this earth that every escaped person spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. And 19 times she walked back out again, north, toward freedom, with frightened, exhausted people following behind her in the dark. And in all of those journeys, through all of those miles of swamp and frozen river and freezing forest, with the dogs always somewhere behind, she never lost a single one of them. Not one. Think about that. Not the way you would skim past it in a book, but slowly, the way you would turn over something heavy in your hands. There are generals with whole armies at their command, with maps and supply lines and the full power of a government behind them, who could not say such a thing. There are men whose names fill the history books who lost hundreds, thousands to far less than what she faced. And here is one small, unarmed-looking woman, walking on foot, by night, with no army and no map and no rights. And her record is perfect. Not one soul lost. Not one. How? How does a woman do a thing like that? How does one small person who could not read a word, who carried a hole in her skull from a childhood injury, who sometimes fell asleep without warning in the middle of a sentence, how does she stand against the largest, richest, cruelest system of human bondage her age had ever produced, and beat it, one human soul at a time? That is what we are going to sit with tonight. Not a date in a textbook, not a name on a statue. The whole life. The frightened child, the grieving daughter, the woman who made an impossible promise and kept it for 10 years. She was born with nothing the law would honor. No birthday written down, no schooling, no rights a single court in the country would recognize. And yet, she became the most wanted fugitive in America, and at the very same time, the most trusted human being that hundreds of desperate people had ever met. Her name, when she was born, was Araminta Ross. The world would come to know her as Harriet Tubman. So keep your eyes closed just a little longer. Because before she was Moses, before she carried a pistol through the cold, before she led gunboats up a Carolina river, she was a little girl in a one-room cabin on the eastern shore of Maryland. And that is where we have to begin. Dorchester County, Maryland, around the year 1822.
No one wrote down the day she was born.
We have to start there, because it tells you everything about the world she was born into. The arrival of an enslaved child was not recorded the way yours or mine was. There was no certificate, no family Bible entry made in careful ink, no celebration. A birth was entered into a plantation ledger, in the same hand, on the same kind of page, that a man would use to record the birth of a calf or a foal. A new piece of property, a figure that would one day have a price. And because no one wrote it down, we will never know it. To this day, historians can only guess at the year. Think of what that means. There is no candle she could ever blow out on the right day, no anniversary the people who loved her could mark. The most basic fact of a human life, the day you arrived in the world, was not considered worth the ink. That single absence, that empty space where a date should be, tells you more about slavery than any speech ever could. It did not only take people's labor and their freedom. It reached back and took the small, ordinary record of their very existence. Her mother's name was Harriet, though everyone who loved her called her Rit. Her father was a man named Ben Ross, and the baby they laid down on the dirt floor of that small cabin with its single window and its smell of wood smoke, they named Araminta. But nobody ever called her by that long, formal name. To her mother, to her father, to the brothers and sisters crowded into that cabin, she was simply Minty. She was one of 9 children born to Rit and Ben. 9. And almost before she could form full sentences, before she understood much of anything about the world, little Minty came to understand the one unbearable fact that hung over her entire family like weather. They did not belong to themselves. Not their hands, not their backs, not their children, not their futures. On any ordinary morning, with no warning at all, a man with a quill and a ledger could decide that one of them was worth more money sold away to a distant state than kept at home. And by nightfall, that person could simply be gone. Minty did not have to imagine this. She watched it happen. 3 of her older sisters, Lena, Mariah Riddy, and Soph, were sold. A trader came, money changed hands, and her sisters were chained into a coffle, a long line of human beings linked together, and marched south toward the cotton and the cane of the Deep South. There was no goodbye that meant anything. No letter ever came back, because no letter ever could. 1 week her sisters were part of the warm, crowded life of that cabin. The next, there were simply empty spaces where they had been. Empty places at the meal, empty sounds in the night, and a grief so total that, in time, no one was even allowed to speak their names out loud, because speaking them only opened the wound again. And here is the detail that should stay with you. Those 3 sisters were never heard from again. Not once. They were swallowed by the Deep South the way a stone is swallowed by a deep river, without a ripple that ever came back. No one in that family ever learned where they went, whether they lived long or died young, whether they had children of their own, whether they ever stopped on some far-off plantation and wondered about the little sister they had left behind. They were simply gone into a silence that lasted the rest of everyone's lives. And a small girl grew up in the shape of that silence, in a home with 3 permanent absences in it. Imagine being a small child and learning in that way what your family is worth to the people who own them. Imagine learning that love is not a protection, that a mother's arms are not a wall, that the people you fall asleep beside can be turned into money while you sleep. Something took root in that little girl in those years. It was not exactly hatred. Hatred would have been simpler and louder. What grew in Minty was quieter and harder and far more dangerous than hatred. It was a refusal. A deep, still, immovable refusal. A sense, even in a child who owned nothing and controlled nothing, that this was wrong. Bone-deep wrong. And that she would not, in her soul, agree to it. She could not have put it into words. She was a child. But that quiet refusal would one day walk 1,000 miles. It would carry a pistol. It would free hundreds of people. For now, though, it was only a feeling in a little girl in a cabin. And the world was about to begin teaching her, in the hardest way it knew how, exactly what it intended to do with her. When Minty was only 5 or 6 years old, an age when a child should be doing nothing more serious than chasing chickens and learning her own name, she was sent away to work. They had a phrase for it. They called it being hired out. Strip away the gentleness of those 2 small words, and here is what they meant. Her enslaver could lend her, like a wagon or a saw or a mule, to other households who would pay him for the use of her small body. And so Minty, barely out of babyhood, was sent off alone, away from her mother, away from the cabin, away from the only warmth she knew, to live among strangers who owed her nothing and felt nothing for her. One of the first places she was sent was the home of a woman named Miss Susan. Miss Susan wanted a girl to keep her house clean through the day and to mind her baby through the night. So a child was given a child to raise. Minty, who still needed mothering herself, was made to be a mother to someone else's infant, around the clock, on no sleep. And when the baby cried at night, as every baby in the history of the world has cried at night, there were consequences. Miss Susan kept a whip on a shelf close to the bed. When the infant woke and wailed and Minty could not quiet it, the whip came down. Years and years later, when Harriet Tubman was an old woman with white in her hair, she could still show people the scars on her neck and her shoulders and her back. Thick, ridged scars she had carried since she was small enough to sit on the floor. She remembered being lashed 5 times before breakfast. 5. Before breakfast. For the crime of being a tired child who could not stop a baby from crying. And think for a moment about what that does to the inside of a child, not only the outside. A small girl, far from her mother, learns that there is no safe hour, that punishment does not wait for a reason, that the same morning light that wakes other children to breakfast wakes her to the whip. She learns to sleep with one part of her mind always awake, always listening for the baby, always braced. That kind of vigilance, learned that young, does not leave a person. In a crueler reading, it broke children. In Minty, strangely, it became something else, a watchfulness, an alertness to danger that would one day keep a dozen people alive in a dark forest. But no one watching that lashed and exhausted little girl could have called it anything but what it was. The slow torture of a child. There were other households, other cruelties. She was sent to a man who set her to checking muskrat traps in the cold marsh water of the rivers, wading in up to her waist in the freezing wet, even when she was sick. At one point, she was so ill with the measles that she could barely stand, and still, they sent her into the water because the traps had to be checked, and she was the one whose job it was to check them. She was hungry much of the time. She was beaten for things that were not her fault and could never have been her fault. She was, in the most literal sense, used up and worn down. A small machine expected to work and to ask for nothing. And I want you to hold on to one thing as we go forward, because it matters. All of this happened before the moment that changed everything, before the great injury, before the visions, before any of it. By the time Minty was a teenager, her body was already a kind of map of what slavery did to the people it claimed. Her back told one story. Her ribs, when she was hungry, told another. She was strong, unusually strong, from the field work that had hardened her young, but she was marked, inside and out. And then came an ordinary errand on an ordinary day in a dry goods store, and a 2-pound piece of iron that would nearly kill her, and, in a strange way she could not have understood at the time, would set the whole rest of her life in motion. She was about 13 years old. She had been sent on an errand to a dry goods store, the kind of country store that sold flour and cloth and nails, with a counter and a scale and a set of iron weights for measuring out goods. While she was there, another enslaved person came in, a young man, a boy not much older than she was, who had slipped away from the fields without permission. And right behind him, furious, came the overseer who had been chasing him. The overseer saw Minty standing there, and he gave her an order. He told her to help him, to grab the boy, to block him, to help tie him so he could be punished. Minty refused. I want you to stop and truly sit with what that meant. This was not a free child weighing a small risk. This was a 13-year-old enslaved girl who already carried the scars of refusal on her own skin, who had already been whipped raw for far less, who knew in her body, not in theory, exactly what defiance cost. And she looked at a grown white man who held total, unquestioned, legal power over her life, a man who could have her beaten or sold for disobedience, and in front of him, she would not lift a hand to help trap another enslaved person. She simply would not do it. And notice, this was not a planned act of resistance. There was no time to weigh it, no chance to be brave in the abstract. It was instant. It came up out of her before thought, the way you pull your hand back from a fire, which tells you that the refusal we spoke of earlier was no longer just a feeling she carried. By 13, it had become part of the very grain of her, so deep that her body acted on it before her mind could calculate the cost. That is who she already was, years before the world had any name for her. The boy bolted for the door, and the overseer, in a rage, snatched up a 2-pound iron weight from the store counter, the heavy kind used to balance the scale, and hurled it across the room after the fleeing boy with all his strength. Maybe he was aiming for the boy. Maybe in his fury he did not care who he hit. He hit Minty. The iron struck her square in the forehead. The force of it crushed part of her skull inward. "It broke my skull," she would say in later years. She went down where she stood. There was no doctor called, of course. Why would there be, for a piece of property? They carried her bleeding and senseless back to the place she was being held, and they laid her down on the hard seat of a weaving loom. And there she stayed, drifting in and out of consciousness for 2 days. No medicine, no physician, no one to sit with her. Just a gravely injured child, left to live or die as she would. Picture the smallness of that scene, because the history books rush past it. A child with a crushed skull laid on the bare wooden bench of a loom, not in a bed, not in a hospital, not even on a blanket on the floor. On a loom, a piece of equipment, as though she were a tool set down between uses. No one held her hand. No one wiped the blood from her face. The people who owned her were, at most, calculating whether their property would recover enough to be worth feeding. And in that terrible stillness, that small body simply fought, alone, to stay alive, and won, by nothing but its own stubborn will to keep breathing. She lived. And then, because in the eyes of that world she was property, and property that does not work has no value, they sent her back out into the fields to labor, with the wound barely closed and the blood still matted in her hair. She was expected to pick up where she had left off, as though nothing had happened, as though a man had not very nearly killed her for the act of refusing to betray another human being. She would carry the physical marks of that day for the remaining 8 decades of her life, a visible dent in her skull and a deep scar across her brow, the same scar you saw catching the starlight in the forest at the beginning of this story. But she carried something else out of that store too, something stranger, something that no one, looking at that broken, bleeding girl on the loom, could possibly have predicted. Because after that blow to the head, the visions began. For the rest of her long life, Harriet Tubman would fall asleep without warning. It could happen at any time, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a meal, in the middle of walking down a road. She would simply drop, all at once, into a deep, sudden sleep, sometimes for a minute, sometimes for much longer. And then, just as suddenly, she would wake and carry on speaking or walking as if nothing at all had interrupted her. She could not control it. She could not predict it. It came when it came. Today, doctors who study her life believe that the iron weight gave her a severe form of what we now call temporal lobe epilepsy, or a related seizure disorder, the brain injury of a child, never treated, carried into adulthood. To the people around her in her own time, it looked like a strange affliction, even a curse. A grown woman who fell asleep mid-step, a worker who could not be relied upon to stay awake. To a man buying labor, it made her seem damaged, less valuable. And later, that very thing would help save her life, because few could imagine that a woman with such a condition could be the daring Moses they were hunting. But here is the thing that matters most about how Harriet understood it. She did not experience it as a wound. She experienced it as a door. During these spells, she had vivid, overwhelming visions and dreams. She saw landscapes she had never traveled. She saw rivers and fields and fences she would later swear she recognized when she finally reached them. She heard voices. She received what felt to her like warnings and guidance and instructions. And Harriet, who was raised in a deeply religious family and who held an absolutely unshakable faith her entire life, came to one conclusion about all of it: that God was speaking to her, directly. That the thing the overseer had tried to destroy when he threw that iron had not been destroyed at all. It had been turned, somehow, into a kind of holy compass. Now, you can believe what you like about where those visions came from. That is between you and your own faith. But here is the part that history records, the part that is almost impossible to explain away. Again and again, that instinct was right. Out on the road, in the years to come, guiding frightened people through the dark, Harriet would sometimes stop without warning. She would insist on changing the route. She would refuse to go forward and turn the whole group back, or freeze them in place and make them wait, for reasons she could not put into words for anyone. The people with her did not always understand. Sometimes they were terrified and wanted to push on. But she trusted the feeling completely, every time. And time after time, that strange certainty steered them around a patrol, away from a trap, off a road where slave catchers were waiting that very night. And put yourself among those passengers for a moment. You are exhausted, half frozen, desperate to keep moving, and the woman leading you suddenly stops in the middle of nowhere and says you must turn back, or wait, or take the longer, harder way. You cannot see a reason. Every instinct in your tired body screams to push forward toward warmth and rest. But you have heard the stories. You have heard that she has never lost a soul. And so you swallow your fear and you trust her. You trust a feeling she cannot even explain, because the alternative is to trust yourself. And your own eyes have already failed to see the patrol waiting on the road ahead. That is the strange faith she asked of people, and that her record earned. Believe the woman, even when the woman cannot tell you why. The blow that was meant to break her mind became, in the end, the very thing that guided her safely through the most dangerous work of her life. But a compass, however sure, is useless in the hands of someone who cannot read the land it points across. And so we have to ask, where did a girl who had never seen a map, who could not read a single word, learn to move 90 miles through black forest in the dead of night without making a sound and without being caught? The answer was waiting for her at home, in that same one-room cabin, in her own mother and father. Her father, Ben Ross, was a timberman. He worked the forests of Maryland's eastern shore, cutting and hauling wood, and over a lifetime of that labor he came to know those woods the way you and I know the rooms of our own homes in the dark. He knew which side of a tree the moss grew on, so a person could find north when there was no sky to read. He knew how to follow the stars through the gaps in the canopy. He knew how to walk across a forest floor of dry leaves and dead branches without making a sound. He knew which plants in the marsh and the wood were safe to eat, which roots could be dug for food, where the water was clean, how to read the weather coming. He knew how to survive, alone, off land that gave nothing freely. And, season by season, year by year, he taught all of it to his daughter. He could not have known what he was doing. As Ben Ross showed his girl how to move unseen, how to find her direction in the dark, how to live off the land, he believed he was simply teaching her to survive in the only world either of them had ever known. He was a father, passing down what he knew. He had no way of imagining that he was, in fact, training the single most successful conductor the Underground Railroad would ever produce. That every lesson would one day be carried south and north again and again, and turned into freedom for dozens of people who would otherwise have died in bondage. Her mother, Rit, taught her something different, but just as important. There came a day when the family's enslaver made plans to sell Rit's youngest son, to hand over one of her boys to a trader from Georgia. Rit was not a soldier. Rit had no power, no rights, no law on her side. But Rit hid her son. For a month, she kept that child hidden, moving him, protecting him, refusing to give him up. And when, at last, the buyer and the enslaver came to the cabin to take the boy by force, Rit stood her ground in the doorway of her own home and told them, that she would split the head of the first man who came through that door to take her child. And they backed down. The sale fell through. The boy stayed. Minty saw that. A child watched her mother, a woman who owned nothing, who could be whipped or sold for it, plant her feet in a doorway and face down the men who held her family's lives in their hands, and win. She learned in that moment a lesson that no one could ever take out of her, that even here, even with nothing, even against everything, a person could say no. A person could stand in a doorway and decide, not this child, not tonight, not while I am still breathing. From her father, then, Harriet learned the woods, the practical, physical knowledge that would keep her and her passengers alive in the dark. From her mother, she learned defiance, the spine, the nerve, the refusal to bow even when bowing was the safer choice. And from both of them, from the prayers and the spirituals and the faith that filled that cabin, she learned to believe in something larger than the cruelty around her. The woods, the defiance, the faith. These were the only inheritance she would ever receive. No money, no land, no freedom. Just those three things. And think about how little that would have seemed to anyone keeping a ledger. No coins changed hands, no deed, no acre, no roof was passed down. By every measure the world around her used to count wealth, she inherited nothing at all. And yet what Ben and Rit put into that child, the knowledge of how to move through the dark, the nerve to stand in a doorway and refuse, the faith to believe a way would open, would prove worth more than any plantation. It would outlast the men who owned plantations. It would free more people than money ever could. The poorest inheritance imaginable turned out to be one of the richest any human being has ever been handed. They would turn out to be enough. But it would be years yet before she understood how to use them, and it would take the worst kind of news to finally set her moving. Around the year 1844, Minty married a free black man named John Tubman. It was around this time that she set aside the name Araminta and took her mother's name instead, becoming Harriet. Harriet Tubman, the name the world would never forget. But here is the cruel arithmetic of that world. Marrying a free man did not make Harriet free. Her status followed her mother's, as the law decreed for all enslaved people. She remained the property of her enslaver, and it meant something even harder to bear, that any children she and John might have would not be born free either. They would be born enslaved, the property of the man who owned her, to be kept or sold as he saw fit. A free husband, a loving marriage, and still the chain held. Live inside that arithmetic for a moment, because it is one of the quiet horrors of slavery that people rarely stop to feel. A married woman, in love, in the years when a couple dreams about the children they might have, and every one of those dreams comes pre-poisoned. To bring a child into the world would be to hand a brand new human being, your own son or daughter, straight into the ledger as property. To love your husband and want his children was at the very same time to risk creating more people to be sold. There was no corner of an enslaved person's most private and tender hopes that slavery did not reach into and foul. Even love, even the wish for a family. Then, in the year 1849, the man who owned her, Edward Brodas, died. To you and me, a death in the family of one's employer might mean very little. but to the enslaved people on that farm, the death of an enslaver was a kind of earthquake, and every one of them knew it. When an enslaver died, his estate had to be settled, his debts had to be paid, and the most valuable property he left behind, more valuable than the land, more valuable than the livestock, was the human beings he had owned. Settling the estate meant selling people. It meant the auction block. It meant families pulled apart to satisfy a dead man's creditors. A quiet, terrible fear moved through the cabins like a draft under a door. And then it took a specific, named shape. Harriet heard, through the whispered network that ran between the quarters, the one that always seemed to know things before the white household spoke them aloud, that she and her brothers were likely to be sold. And not just sold. Sold south. Sold into the deep south, to the cotton and the cane, the very place her 3 older sisters had vanished into all those years ago and never, ever returned from. The chain gang. The coffle. The end of the world, as far as anyone in that cabin understood it. Harriet had watched that happen once already, to her sisters, when she was small and could do nothing. She was not a child now. She went to her husband. She begged John to run with her, to go north together, to take the terrible risk while there was still time. And John refused. Worse than refused. He reportedly threatened that if she tried to run, he would tell. He would give her up. Read that again and let it land. The man she had married, the free man she loved, told her that her bid for freedom would be betrayed by his own mouth. We do not know everything that passed between them. Perhaps John was afraid. He was a free man with something to lose, and helping a fugitive could cost even a free black man his liberty. Perhaps he simply could not imagine the things she was reaching for. But whatever his reasons, the wound of it must have been almost beyond bearing. The one person who was supposed to stand beside her had become one more locked door. And in that moment she learned, again, the hardest lesson of her life. That in the end, the journey toward freedom might be one she would have to make utterly alone, leaving behind even the people she loved most. And so Harriet Tubman came to the loneliest crossroads of her life. She could stay and wait to be sold south into a darkness from which no one came back. Or she could run, alone, without her husband, without the people she loved, into a night full of dogs and patrols and 1,000 miles of unknown country. She chose to run. One night in 1849, Harriet stepped out of the only world she had ever known. She left behind her home, her husband, her parents, her brothers, everything and everyone. She walked into the trees alone. And she understood with perfect clarity that if she were caught, there would be no mercy waiting for her, only the lash, and then the sail she had been running from in the first place. She did not look back. She walked north, into the dark. Think about the loneliness of that first step. There was no one waiting for her on the other side. No one knew her name in the north. She was leaving behind every face she had ever loved, every voice she knew, with no promise that she would ever see any of them again. And in fact, she was walking away from her own husband, who had threatened to betray her. She had no money to speak of, no map she could read, no certainty of a single safe door along the way. She had a direction, north, and a feeling that God went with her and nothing else. Most of us have never in our lives taken a step that lonely. She took it into a forest full of men and dogs who would be paid to bring her back. She traveled by night and she hid by day. Everything her father had taught her in those Maryland woods she now used to stay alive. She followed the North Star, that one fixed point in the turning sky, the slave's compass, the star that pointed always toward free soil. And on the cloudy nights when the star was hidden, she did exactly what Ben Ross had shown her. She felt along the trunks of the trees for the moss that grew thickest on the north side, and let the forest itself tell her which way to go. She kept to the rivers and the water where she could, because moving water breaks a trail and washes away a scent, and the dogs that hunted runaways, the dreaded Negro dogs, bred and trained to track human beings, would lose her at the water's edge. She moved through swamp and marsh and forest, the very terrain that terrified other people, because she had been taught that the wilderness was not her enemy. It was her hiding place. Feel the cold of it for a moment. This was not a summer walk. To wade a Maryland river in the dark is to feel the water close around your legs like iron, to lose the feeling in your feet, to climb out the far side soaked through with the night air cutting at you. To lie hidden in a marsh through the daylight hours is to lie still in the wet and the mud while your body shakes and the hours crawl, not daring to move, not daring to sleep too deeply, listening always for hooves and voices and the baying of dogs. She did this not once but over many days, hungry, alone, every nerve stretched tight. The wilderness was her hiding place, yes, but it was a hard, punishing refuge, and it asked everything of her body to survive in it. She trusted almost no one, but the few she did trust, she trusted with her entire life. Before she left, a white neighbor, a woman, an early link in the secret chain of people who helped runaways, had given Harriet a slip of paper with 2 names written on it. Harriet could not read the names, but she could carry the paper and find the houses and speak the right words at the right doors. And so she was passed, hand to hand, house to house, along a hidden route that stretched through the Maryland countryside and up toward the free state of Pennsylvania. Black families and white families, Quakers and free black men and women, ordinary people who had decided that the law was wrong. They hid her in barns and attics and the backs of wagons, fed her, and sent her on to the next safe place. Nearly 90 miles she traveled this way. 90 miles of darkness and fear and aching feet. 90 miles in which discovery at any single moment would have ended everything. And then, at last, she came to the line, the invisible border between the slave state of Maryland and the free state of Pennsylvania. And she crossed it. Years later, she described that exact moment in her own words, words we still have and which deserve to be heard exactly as she spoke them. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. Close your eyes and picture her there, a small woman, alone, at the edge of a field at dawn, looking down at her own 2 hands as if she had never truly seen them before, because for the first time in her entire life, they belonged to her. After a lifetime of being owned, she was free. It should be the end of the story. The slave escapes, the slave reaches freedom, the music swells. That is where most stories like this would stop. But listen to the very next thing she said, because it is the sentence that explains the entire rest of her life, and it is the reason we are still telling her story tonight. Here is what Harriet said next, after describing that glory of crossing into freedom. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. My home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. Read that last line slowly. I was free, and they should be free. It is, I think, one of the most extraordinary sentences any human being has ever spoken. Because think about what most of us would feel, standing where she stood. She had done the impossible. She had walked out of bondage and lived. She had reached the one place where no man could legally own her. Every instinct of survival, every ounce of common sense screamed the same thing. Stay here. Stay safe. Build a quiet life as far from that border as your legs can carry you, and never, ever go back. No one on earth would have blamed her for it. And instead, standing in her first hour of freedom, she looked back over her shoulder toward the country that had broken her skull and sold her sisters, and she decided that her own freedom was not worth having if the people she loved were still in chains. That is not a normal thought. That is the thought of a particular and rare kind of person. Most of us, having crawled out of a burning building, run from it. Harriet looked at the fire and started planning how to walk back in. And there is something in that sentence even deeper than courage. There is a whole philosophy of what freedom actually is. Most people think of freedom as a thing you possess, like a coat you put on. Once it is yours, you wrap it around yourself and you are warm, and what happens to anyone else is their own affair. Harriet understood it the opposite way. To her, freedom was not something you could truly own alone while the people you loved were in chains. A freedom that left them behind was not freedom at all. It was just a more comfortable kind of grief. And so the only way to actually be free, fully, really free, was to go back into the dark and bring the others out. Her own liberty would not be complete until theirs was too. She made her way to Philadelphia. She found work, cooking, cleaning, scrubbing, whatever an unschooled black woman could find in a northern city, and she saved. She saved every coin she could put her hands on, with a single, fixed purpose burning behind everything she did. She was not saving for a house. She was not saving for comfort. She was saving for return passage into hell. And in the quarters of Philadelphia's free black community, and in the back rooms of the abolitionists, she began to learn the shape of the thing she would join, the loose, secret, dangerous network that people were beginning to call the Underground Railroad. Not a railroad at all, of course. No tracks, no trains. A chain of human courage. Conductors who guided people, stations where they could hide, station masters who sheltered them, all moving passengers north toward freedom under the very noses of the men who hunted them. Harriet listened. Harriet learned. And Harriet began to plan something that, to anyone with ordinary sense, sounded exactly like a slow and certain form of suicide. She was going back. In December of 1850, word reached Harriet in the North that her niece, Keziah, along with Keziah's 2 young children, was about to be sold at auction in Maryland. So Harriet went back. The history books say it so quickly, in so few words, that the enormity of it can slip right past you. She went back. Back across the line, in the wrong direction, into the slave state she had just risked her life to escape, into the very county where people knew her face, where a single recognition, a single notice tacked to a post office wall describing a small woman with a scar on her forehead could mean the end of everything. Recapture, the lash, and the sail south she had run from in the first place. And she did not simply sneak in and slip out. She helped engineer something audacious. The plan turned on Keziah's own husband, a free black man named John Bowley. On the day of the auction, with his own wife and children standing on the block to be sold, John Bowley placed the winning bid. The auctioneer paused the sale to go to his dinner before the money was collected, and in that gap, that small, unguarded window, Bowley spirited his family away. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Keziah and her children were hidden, then moved north, with Harriet helping guide them the rest of the way to freedom. It worked. Her very first rescue. And it worked. And notice what that very first rescue already reveals about how her mind worked. She did not come crashing in with force. She came in with a plan. A clever, patient, almost theatrical plan that turned the slaveholders' own auction against them, that used their own greed and their own dinner hour as the gap to slip through. This was not luck. This was cunning of a very high order, the same cunning that would let her move through enemy country for 10 years without being caught. From the very first attempt, she was not merely brave. She was a strategist. That was the beginning. Over the next decade, through the 1850s, Harriet Tubman returned to the eastern shore of Maryland again and again and again. She made roughly 13 separate trips back into slave territory. With her own hands, she personally led approximately 70 enslaved people out of bondage and north to freedom. Her brothers and their wives, friends, neighbors, strangers, and eventually her own aged parents. And beyond those she guided in person, she gave detailed instructions and directions that allowed dozens more to make the journey on their own. 13 trips. Around 70 souls brought out by her own hand. Each one a separate gamble with her life. Each one undertaken in a country where her capture would have been celebrated, where the law itself was the enemy, where every white stranger was a potential threat and every dog in the distance was a potential death. And through all of it, across all of those journeys, she held to one number with a fierce and quiet pride for the rest of her days. She said it plainly, and she said it true. She never lost a single passenger. Not one. Which brings us to the only question that really matters. The question that slaveholders, slave catchers, and historians have been asking ever since. How? How was such a thing even possible? People have wondered at it for more than a century and a half. How could one small woman, a woman who could not read or write, a woman who carried a serious brain injury, a woman who fell asleep without warning, succeed again and again where armed and able men so often failed? The answer is not magic, though her faith would call it providence. The answer is method, discipline, planning, and an iron, unbreakable nerve. Consider how she timed her escapes. She chose to leave on Saturday nights. This was no accident. In that world, newspapers did not print on Sundays, which meant that runaway notices, the printed advertisements describing escaped people and offering rewards for their capture, could not appear until Monday at the earliest. By leaving Saturday night, Harriet bought her group a head start of more than a full day before the alarm could even be properly raised in print. A day, in that country, could mean 30 or 40 miles. A day could mean the difference between freedom and the auction block. Consider when she traveled. She favored the depths of winter. The nights were longest then, which meant more hours of merciful darkness to move in and fewer hours of dangerous daylight to hide through. And the bitter cold kept ordinary people indoors, off the roads, away from the windows. Fewer eyes to see a line of figures slipping past in the night. Consider the smallest, hardest details. She carried paregoric, a medicine that could quiet an infant, because she knew, with terrible clarity, that a single baby crying in the stillness of the night could give away an entire group, could bring the patrols and the dogs down on a dozen people at once. To save the many, she made sure the smallest could make no sound. Consider her network of hiding places: the potato holes dug into the earth, the false-bottomed wagons, the attics and cellars and barns, the homes of free black families and sympathetic white abolitionists strung like beads along the secret routes north. She knew where every one of them was. She knew which doors would open in the dark. And consider how she communicated when she dared not speak. She used the spirituals, the sacred songs of the enslaved, as a secret code. A particular song, sung in a particular way, could tell those hidden and waiting whether it was safe to emerge, or whether they must stay down, stay silent, stay hidden because danger was near. The hymns that sounded to the overseers like simple religious devotion were, in Harriet's mouth, an operational language. Go down, Moses. Wade in the water, a song some believe carried the very practical instruction to take to the rivers and throw the dogs off the scent. Think about the sheer genius of that, hidden in plain sight. The masters listened to the people they enslaved sing those songs in the fields and on the porches, and heard only quaint, harmless piety, heard, as they imagined, simple folk comforting themselves with religion. They never dreamed that the music drifting across their own plantations was a language they could not read, carrying messages right past their ears. The oppressed had taken the one thing they were allowed, their songs, and turned it into a code the powerful were too arrogant to suspect. Harriet did not invent that, but she wielded it like a master, singing instructions to people in the dark while the men who hunted her heard nothing but a hymn. And above all of it, threaded through everything, were her visions. That strange compass born of a childhood injury, telling her when to move and when to freeze, which road to take and which to abandon. She became so effective and so impossible to catch that the enslaved people who waited and prayed for her gave her a name that would outlive everyone who ever hunted her. They called her Moses, after the prophet who led his people out of bondage across the wilderness toward the promised land. And the slaveholders who lost their human property to this phantom Moses posted rewards and swore they would catch the conductor responsible, never once imagining in their wildest reckoning that the figure stealing away their fortunes in the night was a 5-foot-tall woman who sometimes fell asleep in the middle of a sentence. There is a bitter justice in that blindness, and it is worth sitting with. The very contempt that made them underestimate her was her best disguise. They could not catch her in part because they could not even picture her. Their certainty that a leader must be a man, must be tall, must be lettered and strong and free, that certainty built a blind spot exactly the size and shape of Harriet Tubman, and she walked through it again and again. The prejudice that was meant to keep her down became, in the end, the very thing that let her move unseen. But even Moses did not part the sea alone, and Harriet, for all her courage, could not have done this work without a hidden web of others who risked everything alongside her. Harriet Tubman never worked alone, and she would have been the first to tell you so. No conductor on the Underground Railroad did. The whole enterprise was a chain of human beings, black and white, free and enslaved, famous and forgotten. Each one a link, each one risking ruin, imprisonment, or worse. Harriet was the most fearless link in that chain, the one who went all the way down into the dark to bring people out. But there were hands waiting to receive the people she carried north. 2 of those pairs of hands deserve to be named tonight. In Wilmington, Delaware, there was a Quaker man named Thomas Garrett. By trade, he was a shoe merchant, an ordinary businessman selling boots and shoes. But for decades, Garrett ran one of the most important stations on the entire eastern route, and over the course of his life he is said to have helped some 2,500 fugitives on their way to freedom. He paid a heavy price for it. He was prosecuted, fined so severely that he was nearly ruined financially, and when the judge stripped him of nearly everything he owned, Garrett is said to have told the court that if they knew of any other slave who needed help, to send him, and he would help that one too. He loved Harriet Tubman like family. He gave her money for her journeys. He gave her shoes for the people she was guiding. He gave her shelter and information and trust. When she needed funds to go back for more people, Thomas Garrett found a way to put them in her hand. And in Philadelphia, there was a free black man named William Still, a man history sometimes calls the father of the Underground Railroad. Still worked at the center of the Philadelphia network, helping a great many freedom seekers pass through the city on their way north. But he did something else, something quiet and profound. He kept careful, secret written records of the people who came through his care, their names, where they had come from, the families they had been torn from, where they were headed. It was dangerous to keep such records. If they had been seized, they could have destroyed dozens of lives. But Still understood something the slave traders had tried to make impossible. He understood that these were people, with names and histories and families, and that one day, when the war was over and the chains were struck off, those scattered families might use his records to find one another again. He later published those accounts in a book, and it remains one of the most important first-hand records of the Underground Railroad that we possess. Much of what we know because William Still refused to let those names be erased. And beyond these two, there were countless others whose names we will never know. The station masters who hid runaways beneath church floors, the washerwomen who carried messages, the children who ran signals no patroller suspected, the farm families who left a lantern burning in a particular window to say, "Safe, come in." An entire invisible nation of people who had decided, each in their own way, that the law of the land was a sin, and that they would break it. And it is worth saying plainly what those people were risking, because it was not small. To shelter a fugitive was to gamble your own freedom, your property, your livelihood, sometimes your life. A white farmer could be ruined and jailed. A free black family could be dragged into slavery itself for the crime of helping. These were not people with nothing to lose throwing the dice. Many of them had homes, children, futures, and they quietly decided that a law which commanded them to betray a desperate human being at their door was no law they were bound to obey. It is one of the great proofs in all of history that ordinary, frightened people, in large enough numbers, can choose conscience over the law, and in doing so, can crack a great evil from the inside. Harriet was the one who went down into the darkness to carry the people up. These were the hands waiting at the top to catch them. But sometimes, and this is one of the hardest parts of her story, the gravest danger on the road was not the slave catcher behind you, or the dogs, or the cold. Sometimes the greatest danger was the frightened person walking right beside her. On her journeys, Harriet Tubman carried a revolver. Part of the reason was obvious and practical. The roads were dangerous. There were slave catchers and patrols and men who would have been glad to take her and her passengers by force. A pistol was protection against them. But there was another reason she carried that gun. A harder, sadder reason. And it tells you everything about the impossible weight she chose to bear on those nights. Imagine the journey from the inside. Days of walking through cold and wet and fear. No sleep that feels like sleep. Hunger gnawing constantly. Children to keep quiet. Feet torn and bleeding, the constant terror of the sound of hooves or hounds. And sometimes, somewhere on that brutal road, a person would simply break. The fear would become too much, the exhaustion too deep, and they would stop, and they would say they could not go on, that they wanted to turn back, that they would rather return to slavery than take one more step into the dark. And Harriet could not allow it. Not because she was cruel, she was the opposite of cruel, but because she understood the arithmetic of survival better than anyone alive. A person who turned back would almost certainly be caught, and a person who was caught would be beaten, would be tortured until they gave up what they knew: the route, the safe houses, the names of the people who had sheltered them, and above all, her. One frightened soul turning around in the night could unravel the entire network, could send the patrols to every safe house, could end the lives of everyone who had helped and everyone still waiting to be helped, and everyone who would ever come after. So in those moments, Harriet would do the hardest thing she ever had to do. She would draw the revolver, and she would level it at the person who wanted to quit, and she would tell them, in words that have come down to us across more than a century and a half, "You'll be free, or die." "Keep walking," she was saying. "There is no turning back for your sake and for all of ours. You will reach freedom, or you will not survive the trying, but you will not go back and doom the rest of us." And they kept walking. Every time, they kept walking. It sounds brutal. It was brutal. But understand what she held in her two hands on those nights. She was not holding one life. She was holding every life in that group, and every life back in the safe houses, and every life that would ever depend on this secret road in the years to come. She had made a promise to herself and to her God that she would not lose a single one of them. And the terrible cost of keeping that promise was that sometimes she had to point a gun at a terrified, exhausted human being and refuse to let them throw all of it away. And think of the loneliness of carrying that. There was no one she could share the weight with, no one to tell her she had chosen rightly in that moment. She alone had to decide, in the dark, with lives in the balance, to do the hardest and harshest thing precisely because she loved them. To be fierce in order to be kind. To threaten one in order to save them all. That is a burden most leaders never have to touch, even once. She carried it again and again, and she carried it alone. And she never let it turn her heart cold. She kept the promise. She never lost one. And then, just as her work was finding its rhythm, the United States Congress passed a law that was designed, in effect, to make everything she did impossible. In the year 1850, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It was a monstrous piece of legislation, and its purpose was to extend the reach of slavery into every corner of the country, including the free states of the North. Under this law, slave catchers could legally cross into a free state, seize a black person they claimed was an escaped slave, and drag that person back into bondage in the South. There was no trial. The accused person was not even allowed to testify in their own defense. A black man or woman could be claimed on little more than the sworn word of a white claimant, which meant that not only the recently escaped, but free black people who had lived in the North for years, who had been born free, could be snatched off the street and sold into slavery with almost no legal recourse. And it went further still. The law made it a crime for ordinary citizens of free states to refuse to help capture a fugitive. It threatened fines and imprisonment for anyone who sheltered, fed, or aided an escaped person. It tried, in other words, to force every person in the North to become a slave catcher, or else a criminal. The consequence was immediate and chilling. Overnight, the northern states were no longer a refuge. A person who would walk 1,000 miles to freedom in Philadelphia or New York could now be hunted down and returned. The free soil that Harriet had wept with joy to reach was no longer safe ground. So Harriet Tubman did what she always did when the world raised an obstacle in her path. She did not stop. She simply raised her own goal to meet it. From that point forward, she no longer guided her people merely to the northern free states. She led them all the way to Canada, across the border, beyond the reach of American law entirely, where the long arm of the Fugitive Slave Act could not follow. It meant hundreds of additional miles. It meant more cold, more danger, more nights on the road. It meant guiding exhausted people across an international border in the dead of winter. For several years, Harriet made her own home in St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, and she brought her people there, to that place of true safety, and helped build a community of formerly enslaved men and women who had finally, fully escaped the country that had claimed to own them. The law had tried to make the road impossible. All it actually did was make the road longer, and Harriet kept walking it. But there was still one journey left that she felt she had to make, perhaps the most personal and the most unlikely of them all. By the year 1857, Harriet's parents, Ben Ross and Rit, the father who had taught her the woods and the mother who had stood in the doorway, were growing old, and they were in danger. Her father, Ben, was suspected by the local authorities of having helped other freedom seekers escape. There was a real threat that he would be arrested. The two of them needed to get out of Maryland. But they were elderly now. They could not possibly walk the long, brutal, sleepless route that even the young and the strong barely survived. The standard methods of escape were simply impossible for them. So Harriet did what she always did. She went back for them anyway. And she improvised. Unable to move her aging parents on foot through the wilderness, she found another way. She rigged up a makeshift wagon, by some accounts a simple cart pulled by a horse with a board fixed across it for them to sit on, and she carried her elderly mother and father out of Maryland in it. Out of the slave state, north through the country, mile after mile, all the way to freedom. She got them to safety. Eventually, she brought them, too, into the free air of the North. Now, stop and feel the shape of this. The woman who, as a small girl, had stood by helpless and watched her 3 older sisters chained and marched away forever. The child who could do nothing while her family was torn apart and sold into the distance, had grown into the woman who reached back, as if reaching back through her own childhood, and pulled her own mother and father out of the very darkness that had swallowed her sisters. The little girl who lost 3 sisters made absolutely certain she would not lose her parents too. It is one of the quietest triumphs of her whole life, and one of the most human. Not a raid, not a rescue of strangers. Just a daughter refusing to leave her old mother and father behind in a place that meant them harm. And in a way, this single rescue answers the wound we started with. Remember the 3 sisters who vanished into the deep South, the empty places at the table, the names no one was allowed to speak? Harriet could not undo that. No one could. But she could refuse to let it happen again. She could not reach back through time and unchain Lena and Mariah Riddy and Soph. but she could reach back into Maryland and lift her mother and father out before the same darkness took them too. The grief of her childhood became the fuel of her courage. The helplessness of the little girl became the resolve of the woman. And then, in 1861, the long, simmering crisis of the nation finally broke open. The country tore itself in two. The Civil War began. And Harriet Tubman, who had spent a decade waging her own private war against slavery in the dark, now went to join the war being fought in the open. She went to the front. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet Tubman did not stay safely in the North and wait to hear how it ended. She went south again, this time openly, in service of the Union cause, and she gave that war everything she had. She began by serving as a nurse. She tended to soldiers and to the great crowds of newly freed and escaping enslaved people, the men, women, and children who flooded toward the Union lines, many of them sick and dying of dysentery and smallpox and the other diseases that swept through the camps. She used the knowledge of herbs and roots and natural remedies that she had learned long ago in the enslaved community of her childhood, the healing wisdom passed down in the quarters, to treat the suffering and to save lives. She moved through wards full of dying men without fear of the contagion, and people remarked that she never seemed to fall ill herself. And notice that even here, in the middle of a war, she was doing the same work she had always done, only in a different uniform. The knowledge she used to heal those dying soldiers was not learned in any school. It was the medicine of the enslaved quarters, the roots and the herbs passed hand to hand among people the country had thrown away. The nation that had refused her people everything was now being nursed, in its hour of crisis, by the very wisdom it had despised. She asked for no rank and little pay. She simply went where the suffering was worst and made herself useful, the way she always had. But Harriet became something far more dangerous to the Confederacy than a nurse. She became a scout and a spy for the Union Army. And truly, who on this earth was better suited to the work? Who knew more about moving unseen through hostile Southern country in the dark? Who better understood how to read the land, how to travel without being caught, how to disappear? And above all, who could earn the trust of the enslaved people still living on the plantations of the South, the people who knew every road, every river crossing, every hidden path, every Confederate position, better than the woman they already whispered about as Moses? Harriet organized and led a network of black scouts, many of them formerly enslaved men who knew the local terrain intimately. They gathered intelligence and brought it to her, the locations of Confederate troops and supply depots, the movements of soldiers, and, crucially, the places where the Confederates had planted explosive mines, torpedoes in the rivers to destroy any Union vessel that tried to pass. She fed this intelligence to the Union command, and in June of 1863, it led to something that had never happened before in the history of the United States, something no woman had ever done. On the night of June 1st into the early hours of June 2nd, 1863, Harriet Tubman became the first woman in American history to plan and lead an armed military raid. Using the intelligence she and her scouts had gathered, she guided 3 Union gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina, through waters where the Confederates had sunk their explosive torpedoes, steering the boats safely around the hidden mines because she knew from her informants exactly where the danger lay. Up the river they went, into the heart of plantation country, past the great estates where hundreds of human beings were still held in bondage. And as the boats moved upriver and Union soldiers came ashore to set the plantations and their storehouses ablaze, word raced through the slave quarters along the banks like fire through dry grass. The boats, the Yankee boats. Freedom is on the river. And the people came. They came pouring out of the fields and the cabins and down toward the water, hundreds of them. They came running, stumbling, carrying their children on their hips and on their backs, carrying babies and bundles, carrying chickens and squealing pigs and steaming pots of rice still hot from the fire. Everything they owned and could grab in their arms in the few mad minutes they had. They waded into the river. They crowded toward the rowboats that came to ferry them out to the gunboats. So many came, so desperate not to be left behind that the boats could barely hold them. Harriet later remembered the chaos of it, the children crying, the people clinging to the sides of the boats, the sheer, overwhelming flood of humanity rushing toward freedom all at once. And in that chaos, it was Harriet they turned to. The story is told that the crowd was so frantic, so afraid of being left on the bank, that the rowboats could not push off. People clung to them and would not let go. And the officer in command turned to Harriet and asked her to speak to her people. So she sang. She lifted her voice over the panic and the noise, and she sang to them, and the sound of her steadied them enough that the boats could move, load after load, out to the gunboats and away. Even here, in the middle of a military raid, her instrument was the same one she had used on the Underground Railroad. Her voice and the trust of the people who heard it. In that single night, the Combahee River raid freed more than 700 enslaved people. Let that number rest beside the other one for a moment. Across all those years on the Underground Railroad, across 13 secret trips into Maryland, she had brought out around 70 people by her own hand, one terrified group at a time, each one a separate brush with death. And now, in one night, on one river, guiding gunboats through mined water, more than 700. The woman who had been struck down as a child and left to die on a weaving loom. The woman who could not read. The woman who fell asleep in the middle of her own sentences. That woman had just helped free more human beings in a single night than most people who called themselves abolitionists would touch in an entire lifetime. She should have been a national hero from that day forward. There should have been parades, pensions, honors, a comfortable old age paid for by a grateful nation. Instead, here is how her country chose to repay her. This is the part of the story that should make you angry. I think it is meant to. After everything, after the 19 trips into slave territory, after the 70 souls led out of bondage, after the years of nursing the sick and dying, after the scouting and the spying, after the Combahee River and the 700, after all of it, the government of the United States did not properly pay Harriet Tubman for her service. Not for years. Not for decades. She had risked her life over and over again for the Union, and when the guns finally fell silent, she was left to fend for herself with almost nothing. She returned to her home in Auburn, in upstate New York, and she lived in poverty. And here is the thing that tells you who she truly was, all the way down to the bone. Even in that poverty, even with so little for herself, she opened her home to others. She took in the sick. She took in the elderly. She took in the orphaned and the destitute, the formerly enslaved who had nowhere else to go. She gave away what little she had to people who had even less. She eventually helped establish a home for the aged and the needy on her own land, the Harriet Tubman home, and she poured herself into caring for others until there was almost nothing left of her own resources. She had to fight for years, to petition, to gather testimony, to wait through endless bureaucratic delay, before she finally received a government pension. And even when it came to her largely not for her own remarkable service, but as the widow of her second husband, Nelson Davis, a black Civil War veteran. Her own service as a scout, a spy, and the leader of an armed raid was barely acknowledged in her lifetime. The woman who had done so much was made to beg, in effect, for a small monthly sum. And let us say the plain truth of it. Had Harriet Tubman been a white man who had scouted for the army, gathered the intelligence, and led an armed raid that freed 700 people in a single night, that man's name would be carved on monuments, taught to every schoolchild, attached to forts and warships and holidays. There would have been no decades of begging, no pension granted as an afterthought through a husband's service. The slowness of her country to honor her was not an oversight. It was a measure of exactly how little it was prepared to value a black woman, no matter what she had done. The injustice of her later years was the same injustice she had fought her whole life, wearing a quieter face. The woman who never lost a single passenger was, in the end, very nearly lost herself. To neglect, to poverty, to the slow forgetting of a country that took everything she had to give and was so terribly, shamefully slow to give anything back. But she did not grow bitter. She kept her faith. She kept caring for others. She lived a long life, far longer than the iron weight or the slave catchers or the war had any right to allow. And in the year 1913, surrounded by family and friends and the people she had spent her whole life serving, Harriet Tubman died, an old, old woman who had once been a little girl named Minty on a dirt floor in a one-room cabin. Those who were with her at the end say that her last words were a promise spoken from Scripture, the words of the gospel she had carried her whole life. I go to prepare a place for you. Even dying, she was talking about making a way for others to follow. Think about that. Not a word of complaint, not a backward glance at all the country had failed to give her. At the very end, her mind was where it had always been, out ahead of the people she loved, going first into the unknown, getting the next place ready so that those who came behind her would find it safe when they arrived. She had spent her whole life as a conductor, going ahead into the dark to bring others through. She died believing she was doing it still. And so we come, at the end, back to where we began. Close your eyes one more time. A forest at night, no moon, the cold and the damp, the sound of dogs far off through the trees, and a small woman with a scar across her forehead standing in the dark, holding out her hand to you. 19 times she stepped through that door. 19 times she walked away from the safety she had bled for and turned back toward the one place on earth that had every reason and every right, in the eyes of its own law, to kill her. She did not do it because she was forced to. No one made her go back. She did it because she had decided, alone, in her first hour of freedom, that her own liberty was a hollow and meaningless thing as long as the people she loved were still in chains. And 19 times she came back out of the dark with frightened, trusting, exhausted people walking behind her. And she never, not once in all of it, lost a single soul. They called her Moses. They posted rewards for the capture of the fugitives she spirited away, and swore they would catch the mysterious conductor behind it. And they never did. The blow that was meant to break her mind became the strange compass that guided her through 100 dangers. The lessons her enslaved father taught her in the Maryland woods, how to find north, how to walk in silence, how to live off the land, became the road to freedom for hundreds of human beings. The defiance her mother showed in a cabin doorway became a defiance that bent the course of a nation. This is not, in the end, a story about a victim. I want you to hear that clearly. It is a story about the most determined human being this country may have ever produced. A person who looked at the largest, richest, cruelest system of her age, a system backed by laws and money and guns and the full force of the state, and who decided, alone, in the dark, with nothing but the woods and her faith and her own 2 feet, that she was going to beat it. One soul at a time. She was born with nothing the law would honor. No recorded birthday, no name the world would write down, no schooling, no rights, no freedom. And out of that nothing, she made herself into the most trusted, most fearless conductor on the Underground Railroad, a Union scout and spy, the first woman to lead an armed raid in the Civil War, and a liberator of hundreds. And I want you to remember her not as a statue and not as a face on a banknote, but as what she actually was, a real, living, breathing woman, small and tired and often in pain, who was afraid every single night and went anyway. That is the thing worth carrying out of this story. Courage was never the absence of her fear. Courage was the hand held out in the dark in spite of it. She was flesh and blood, as real as you are, with a body that ached and a heart that pounded. And she did these things not because they were easy for her, but because they were right, and because someone had to, and because she had decided that someone would be her. She walked into hell 19 times, and she never lost a single soul. Her name was Harriet Tubman. And now that you have walked even a little way beside her in the dark, you know why we still say it. If this story has moved you tonight, I hope you will do one small thing. Light a candle, in your heart, if not in your hand, for all the ones who walked behind her through the dark, and for all the ones who never got the chance to. Then share this with someone you love, because someone you love needs to hear this story tonight. And if you want to keep walking through these forgotten corners of history with us, stay a while. Subscribe. There are so many more names that were almost erased, and we are not done speaking them.